My name is Will Schmenner. I'm the head of public programs here at the Clark, and it's my pleasure to introduce today's program. The Paul Goesch exhibition is incredibly timely, it's incredibly rare, and it's something that I'm really thrilled to continue to learn about from one of my favorite partners in crime here at the Clark. So please join me in welcoming the curator of the exhibition, the curator of contemporary projects here at the Clark, Robert Wiesenberger.
Thanks, Will, and thank you all for being here. I want to give a special thanks to Catherine and Frank Martucci and Linda Genera and Timur Galen for their generous support of this project. And I wanted to start with a manifesto. The year is 1920, and the title is Ruf zum Bauen, Call to Build. The author is the Arbeitsrat für Kunst, the Work Council for Art, a revolutionary group of artists and architects who had just formed in the aftermath of World War I and the early years of the Weimar Republic, Germany's first democracy. It was, of course, a time of tremendous trauma, deprivation, but also radical possibility. The Work Council demanded that, quote, art should not be for the enjoyment of the few, but for the life and happiness of the masses. They called to dissolve the art academies, to build experimental and workers' housing, and to tear down, quote unquote, artistically valueless monuments, which were a good source of building material. Most of them were painters and sculptors, but they were led by architects. And architectural metaphors as well. Bruno Taut, an architect and one of the most outspoken members of the group, declared, quote, the carrier of the spiritual forces, molder of the sensibilities of the general public is architecture. So almost exactly 100 years ago, the task of rebuilding after catastrophe was seen as at once physical and spiritual. And architects in particular would lead the charge. I should add that this revolution, actual revolution, is after all very much in the air. This is Käthe Kollwitz's 1920 woodcut, which you'll see in our exhibition, of the funeral of Karl Liebknecht, a leader of the Communist Party who was, with Rosa Luxemburg, brutally murdered by government and right-wing forces the year before in the Spartacist uprising. Kollwitz was, incidentally, related by marriage to Paul Goesch. Back to our call to build. It was both a manifesto and an exhibition catalog for the Arbeitsrat's second exhibition. The text is written by Adolf Behne, an art historian and critic who directed the group. And Behne begins his text by acknowledging the lack of resources after the war, but the abundance of hope. And his text is illustrated, as you'll see, with a curious image. Visitors to the exhibition would have recognized this drawing as the work of Paul Goesch. It's a gouache drawing, so it's an opaque watercolor medium, and graphite. It's a little larger than this sheet of paper. The scale and the setting are totally unclear, whether it's massive or miniature. Where we are, likewise, there's a kind of uneven line designating the ground plane. The artist inscribed it with the legend, sketch for a triumphal gate. So a typology as ancient as Roman military monuments, but here in deeply unfamiliar form. The central arch is pointed, as in Gothic architecture, giving it an ecclesiastical feel, and the flanking ones are more or less rounded. The columns are a kind of abstracted Corinthian with cartoonish vegetal capitals, and the colonnettes, built up from organic parts, look to me like cairns, the kind of stacks of rocks you might use to mark a trail. And some are especially wiggly and structurally suspicious, almost rococo. I'm looking at this one. On the far right, there seems to be a figure capped with something like a crown, a sort of regal touch. And above it all, a kind of filigree or tracery with a crackling energy. What material could that be? And the color, a peculiar but somehow successful palette. The whole storybook structure has a feel that is at once celebratory and perhaps vaguely sinister, and it's a wonderful, in my mind, and curious drawing But why on earth would it illustrate something titled Call to Build? Why and how could something so manifestly unbuildable serve as an illustration to that manifesto? Well, the author Adolf Behne was, after all, a level-headed critic. He was a socialist alive to the urgent need for affordable housing in the aftermath of a catastrophic war. But his argument, his call, was in fact for more imagination in architecture, so that new building would not reproduce the failed old order. And in this respect, Paul Goesch had a great deal to offer. Paul Goesch is not a big name in art or architectural history, to say the least, but our exhibition is the first on him in North America. And yet still, I want to argue that he stands out among his formidable peers at this time for his formal inventiveness and range, his kaleidoscopic color sense, and his playful and pluralistic embrace of architectural history. Gösch also struggled throughout his life with schizophrenia, a condition for which he was institutionalized and ultimately murdered by the Nazis. That Gösch was in creative community with the most progressive designers of his day was made possible by a confluence of circumstances. In the early post-war years, when a lack of construction materials, but also of a stable currency and financing, made any kind of building difficult, the collaborative, compromise-prone, and physics-bound work of architecture lived only on paper as the visionary emanations of the mind. And in a time when German Expressionists privileged intuition, feeling, and formal experimentation, Gösch was considered an exemplary expressionist. Increasingly connected avant-garde media networks also allowed him to correspond, exhibit, and publish, even while institutionalized. Gösch produced some 2,000 drawings in and outside of institutions. They are religious, mythological, folkloric, they're portraits and landscapes, they're architectural fantasies and total abstractions. Architectural drawings are the focus of our exhibition and, of course, the collection of the CCA, the Center for Canadian Architecture, which has over 200 drawings by Gösch and whose work forms the basis of our show. And among these architectural drawings, the typology of the portal or the passageway predominates. And it also forms a kind of structuring metaphor for our exhibition. The portal here represents both the metaphysical passages of Gösch, the spiritualist, steeped in Christian theology and occultism, as well as the altered states of a schizophrenic and the so-called doors of perception, in Aldous Huxley's famous phrase. Portals also evoke Gösch's liminal status between art and architecture, sanity and madness, the architecturally trained insider and the institutionalized outsider. These categorical confusions and biases have plagued Gösch's reception, and as Raphael Koenig explains in the essay in our catalog accompanying this show, they've contributed to his erasure from history. So, Paul Goesch. He was born into an educated, well-to-do household in the northern German city of Schwerin. He moved with his family to Berlin at age 2. Though he was baptized Lutheran, he became, in his words, fervently Catholic in his teens and was, quote, overwhelmed by the stunning splendor of the church, end quote. This is a rare autobiographical account that registers an early experience of the power of architecture. He performed poorly in school and suffered from chronic illness. Isolated from his classmates, Gösch retreated more and more into himself. Still tutored by an older student, he developed a love of art, literature, and architecture from ancient Greece to the German Romantics, and went on to study architecture all around Germany. In 1909, in a session with the pioneering Austrian psychoanalyst Otto Gross, he experienced his first breakdown and entered a sanatorium for treatment. Returning to Berlin a year after that, Gösch received a diploma as a state construction foreman, a position which he seems only to have worked for a few months. Gösch had a deep global curiosity. His interest in theosophy and the esoteric teachings of Rudolf Steiner, with their focus on the energies connecting the outer natural world and the inner spiritual one, were prominent. Gösch joined Steiner's Anthroposophical Society in 1913, a year after its founding, and took part in the construction of the first Goetheanum, the Society's headquarters in Dornach, Switzerland, considered a major achievement in the loose category of Expressionist architecture. During the war, Gösch worked as a civil servant in the post office before again being institutionalized from 1917 to 19. It was there that he produced both figurative drawings and architectural fantasies that were sent in response to a call from Heidelberg University's psychiatric hospital, which sought to expand its holdings of works produced by patients in fellow institutions. This would become the Sammlung Prinzhorn, the Prinzhorn collection, still active today, and Gösch was to be one of the few artists in it with formal training. Here is Prinzhorn's landmark 1922 book, Artistry of the Mentally Ill. Upon his release, Gösch moved back to Berlin and took a studio in his family's home. He was active as a member of the Arbeitsrat für Kunst and the November Group, named for the November Revolution that inaugurated the Weimar Republic. He was also a member of the Glass Chain, the Gläserne Kette, about a dozen architects who traded drawings and texts about the architecture of the future. It was named for glass, a favored material among the members, and the chain is in chain letter. They wrote to one another and exchanged ideas. It was led by Bruno Taut, whose Christmas greeting card / crystal tower proposal you're seeing here, and also appears in our show. It's a reprographic, it's multiple that could be sent through the mail and exchanged in this highly mediated avant-garde moment. Taut was also the designer of the only executed building in our exhibition from 1914. This is the Glass House, the Glass Pavilion, and the frieze is ringed by aphorisms from the Expressionist poet Paul Scherbart. For example, what we're seeing here is bunte Glas zerstört den Hass, colored glass destroys hate, which may be true. It's a utopian suggestion. And of course, this black and white picture elides the color that was so crucial to this material. You'll see here Taut's prototype for a toy, glass block toy. And of course, Orientalism was a prominent feature also of this interpretation. You see this kind of palace here flanked by palm trees. It's worth noting the long shadow cast by this group in this moment. Other members of it included Hans Scharoun, who designed, among many other things, the Berlin Philharmonic in 1960 or so. So if you saw the movie Tar, it was mostly set here. And Walter Gropius, who moved to the Commonwealth of Massachusetts in the mid-30s and established an office in the 1940s and built this building at Harvard in the 1950s. And exactly 50 years ago, this year, his firm, not him, designed the building we're in now. Obviously a far cry from the work of Paul Goesch. Gropius established the Bauhaus in 1919, and as much as he'd want us to forget it, that institution began with expressionist, mystical, occultist roots. And we're looking at the prospectus for the school advertising it, whose frontispiece on the right is a woodcut by Lionel Feininger of this kind of crystalline cathedral thrusting skyward. In our exhibition, we have another woodcut by Feininger of a provincial old church that is sort of takes us back to the future in this vision of a utopian possibility. Another member of the glass chain is Hermann Finsterlin, an artist, architect, poet, and toy maker. He, in this drawing here, also from the CCA and also in our exhibition, clearly had a very organic, formal sense, was also, like Gösch, fascinated by anthroposophy. Two floor plans by Finsterlin, not the ones in our show, but we have some wonderful examples as well. And though it was an underground group, or intended to be so, Bruno Taut published many of the writings and drawings of the glass chain in his journal, Frühlicht, which means dawn. And that journal included other strains of the avant-garde that moment, so Antonio Gaudí, Walter Gropius, Mies van der Rohe, all appear there. And yet, I was struck to find that Paul Goesch is exceedingly well represented in this journal. He is tied for the most illustrated figure in this avant-garde publication, tied with two others. But it's a measure, in my mind, of how valued he was by his avant-garde peers. In 1920, Gösch was exhibited by the Gallery Flechtheim, which also represented Wassily Kandinsky, who's also in our show, Paul Klee, and Picasso. In this little pamphlet that we have in our library here. You see Gösch's name at the upper left. And yet by mid-1921, Gösch was institutionalized again and would remain so with brief interruptions for the rest of his life. Gösch was persecuted by the Nazis along with other members of the avant-garde, but doubly so both for his mental health and his avant-garde work. This is a propaganda pamphlet of the mid-1930s called Säuberung des Kunsttempels, cleanup or purification of the art temple. You see, and specifically this is a roundup of the November group of which Gösch was a part. At the top left is the work of Hanne Höch, the Dadaist. At the bottom right is a mural by Paul Goesch. In 1937, Gösch appears in the Degenerate Art Exhibition, the Entartete Kunst exhibition, or exhibitions plural, I should say. It was a traveling show with modifications. It was an exhibition that famously maligned modern art and specifically cast it in terms of illness. So the terms you're seeing here up here say things like mental decay, diseased fantasists, and insane incompetence. And Gösch was one of the only artists, perhaps the only, who was exhibited again, both as someone who was mentally ill and as someone who was a representative of the avant-garde. The text of the show explains here that these are artists who have been awarded by Judenklicke, cliques of Jews, so Flechtheim then, Wiesenberger now, and art is in quotes, Kunst. So this is the kind of language that you expect from someone who has a Greek statue in their Twitter avatar. But by 1940, as part of the T4 program that euthanized specifically the mentally ill, Gösch was, along with 300,000 others, murdered by the Nazis. I want to go back to this typology, because I read it as marking the way to another state, whether holiness, enlightenment, or utopia. For a devout believer like Gösch, the portal is a charged architectural element, marking the boundary between profane and sacred realms, and in medieval Christian architecture representing the gate of heaven. Gösch was surely aware of the biblical symbolism of salvation as a kind of passage. For example, in Christ's words, quote, "I am the gate, whoever enters through me will be saved," end quote. You can also see Gösch's interest in altars as defining a holy space, and here this extraordinary drawing is in the Kupferstich cabinet, the prints and drawings collection of the Berlin museums. And I want to click through to a couple delightful details. And one in particular here, actually, if you see, Gösch has embellished what should just be the background with a figure of two people in a rowboat cast about on the purple seas here. And we have another portal here, 3 pointed arches, but overgrown, and I think one could see this image as in some ways somewhat unsettling. It might evoke the arabesque pattern, the so-called arabesque pattern, which is the subject of an exhibition here by my colleague Anne Leonard, visible in this mid-19th century German Romantic print. Or perhaps Art Nouveau, or its German counterpart Jugendstil. This is Victor Horda's Hotel Tassel from 1892. But Gösch's ornament seems part vegetable, part mineral. It is indeed unsettling. But his architecture is also often unsettled, without grounding, like temples in the sky. And I want to note a recent, as in about 3 days ago, observation by one of our current scholars in residence, the architectural historian Shundana Yusuf, who cited Karl Marx's famous line that all that is solid melts into air on the transformative effects of modernization under capitalism. I'm also reminded of art historian Hal Foster, who speculated that, quote, "the schizophrenic and paranoid visions recorded in the Prinzhorn collection may be symptomatic of a crisis in the symbolic order specific to the capitalist modernity of the time," end quote. In any case, Gösch's unsettled architecture also relates to a cultural critique of the time. Paul Schürze-Naumburg, an architect and author and a passionate Nazi, wrote books like Art and Race and denounced modernist and non-Aryan architecture for not being bodenständig, tied to the earth. And indeed, Gösch's architecture is consistently atectonic and unmoored, seemingly structurally impossible. This altar, which is in our exhibition, is surrounded by a kind of radiant aura. It mixes what looks like streamers and daggers that are in no way load-bearing. And stepping back, I want to suggest that Gösch's popularity with his avant-garde peers, even when depicting history, which was among the avant-garde verboten, was about re-enchanting the possibilities of architecture itself. For example, this generally Baroque facade with its dazzling density of color and texture, perhaps from polychrome veined marble or incrustations of mosaic. It's hard to know, and yet even in a pen and ink drawing, his work pulses with a kind of energy. Gösch's fascination with global architectural history is clear, as in this drawing, which represents a stylized and colorized stupa, a Buddhist monument. Or this facade, in which the finials suggest the papyrus ornament of ancient Egypt. Even the set of classical arcades in pyramid form is given a dreamy quality by floating pastel clouds and zigzags. Gösch gathered up global forms like so much spolia, repurposing them in new forms. This permissive openness about architecture was rare in his circles. He wrote that Berlin, not really the most attractive city then or now, was as beautiful as the ancient city of Palmyra, and that, quote, the diverse architectural epochs are like the breathing in and out of human genius, crystallized in the stony music of the metropolis, end quote. I think of Gösch's sense of pastiche, his playful, permissive embrace, as proto-postmodern. And just as one example of what I'm referring to here is the Strada Novissima at the 1980 Venice Biennale, a simulated street with cardboard facades and a mashup of styles, an early touchstone of postmodernism. And regarding history, here is a chapel by Gösch, covered in the ornament of human heads. It is an outlier among the works in our show, which are all from 1920 or the first half of 21. This is from 1918, when he was institutionalized. But I want to suggest that for someone who is so conversant in architectural history that all buildings speak, they're chatty, they're loquacious, and that Gösch was alive to this chatter of forms and suggestive ornament. Looking also at a somewhat anthropomorphic drawing in our show, this grotto made from gemstones or hard candies, it's hard to tell. I want to contrast this quick and somewhat crude drawing with this one, which has a remarkable delicacy of line. I think of it as potentially being a design for an undersea passage made of gently waving kelp. Maybe. And in a letter to the glass chain, Gösch discussed these sorts of distinctions. He wrote about how everyone knows, from school days onward, the shame of trying to draw something and doing it badly. And he wrote, quote, but if you approach these distortions that come, so to speak, from yourself, with more understanding, you'll discover in yourself a much higher level of creative ability than the one you were initially trying to develop. This ability makes visible to us those aspects of the objects that we mentally hanker after, subconsciously and supraconsciously, and reveals how the objects relate to us, end quote. Gösch identifies this as, quote, the modern tendency not to eliminate the instinct for ugliness, but to set it free and ennoble it. And that text, as it's reproduced in Taut's journal, is commented upon by Bruno Taut with an appended note that marks it as a kind of paradigm shift. Taut writes, quote, The cold, rational notion of correctness is being transformed in favor of artistic understanding and feeling, to each his own, and to art its own correctness. Leaning into his intuitions and love of decoration, Gösch made these total abstractions, which you'll see in the last gallery of our show. The density of line work suggests an engraving in abstract forms that might evoke geology in stalactites or in places, perhaps even human figuration. And in 1920, Adolf Behne, the art historian and leader of the Work Council for Art, who we've already met, profiled Paul Goesch, whose self-portrait is here at the top right. And he compared Gösch to a monk who, quote, lives withdrawn from the world. Gösch is quoted describing his influences, especially the Baroque architecture of the Zwinger Palace in Dresden on the left and the Louvre in Paris on the right, and likewise the temple complexes of Cambodia, such as Angkor Wat. Behne writes that Gösch, quote, renders his dreams to which a mysterious necessity leads him. And employing a trope typical of the reception of art variously labeled naive or folk at this time, Behne observes, quote, his drawings appear timeless, just as children's drawings are timeless, as folk art is timeless, as art is timeless. Behne concludes with soaring praise. I can't think of anyone besides Paul Klee who's as close to the creative source of ornament as Gösch. Still, however tempting, I want to avoid pathologizing Gösch's art. While this drawing was made while he was institutionalized, it's not in our show, and it's an exception to the work that we're exhibiting, between 1917 and 19, the architecture that I've presented was made in this very narrow 2-year period when he was not institutionalized. Likewise, the diagnosis of schizophrenia, a very new term at the time, at first referring to multiple conditions, cannot be considered, 100 years later, anything like secure. Moreover, a diagnosis cannot be derived from an artwork, as even Prinzhorn himself acknowledged. As a schizophrenic subject to delusions and hallucinations, Gösch built his own complex mythologies, legible only to him. Still, it's striking that of the 2,000 drawings that survive, the most frequent subjects are architectural facades and human faces. It's perhaps no accident that Gösch favored the etymologically twinned fronts of buildings and of people. Each represent a scaffold onto which the artist could project his visions and a field of play for experiments in form, color, and mark-making. Indeed, both systems presented a kind of order for the artist. As Hal Foster has written of artists in the Prinzhorn collection, far from a revolt against convention, which is how they're generally conceived of or fetishized for having done by many modernists and surrealists and art brut and so on, far from a revolt against convention, Foster writes, quote, psychotic representation attests to a frantic desire to reinstate convention, to reinvent order, which the psychotic feels to be broken and so in desperate need of repair or replacement, end quote. In this sense, architectural orders, a recombinant system of architectural styles, begins to make a lot more sense. To conclude, Paul Goesch was an architect who never built, but he did execute several murals. This one, from 1921, decorated a ballroom in a social housing complex designed by his colleague Bruno Taut. From what photos survive, a phantasmagoria of abstract, technicolor forms teemed across the walls and the ceiling. An ecstatic design within Taut's cautiously modernist building seems to me a fitting metaphor for Gösch's place in early 20th century architecture and Expressionism more broadly. An interiority both spatial and psychic, repressed and then erased on the way to functionalism and followed by fascism. Indeed, this building was bombed during the war. so only this postcard survives. As mentioned, the Bauhaus was founded in 1919 with Lionel Feininger's image of a crystalline cathedral, but by 1923, under the influence of Soviet constructivism, the school reoriented itself in terms of a new unity between art and technology and disavowed its quasi-mystical origins. By the mid-1920s, glass and steel buildings sprout up across Germany. In 1925, curator Gustav Hartlaub, who had 5 years earlier acquired Gösch's drawings for the Mannheim Museum, would coin the term Neue Sachlichkeit, new objectivity, to name a sober and matter-of-fact tendency that marked an endpoint to Expressionism. Of course, this too was short-lived. Following its rise in 1933, the Third Reich either crushed or co-opted various strains of modernism, with dire consequences for artists and architects, especially those deemed ethnically, sexually, or psychologically aberrant. Under fascism, Gösch's ungovernable visions became untenable. I want to end with this image titled Ich werde berühmt, Selbstporträt, I will be famous, self-portrait, in which Gösch's name appears on every building and advertising column of the city. And it could be a delusion of grandeur, or playful self-ironizing, or a paranoid vision. And it's one that's set in the media architecture of a metropolis, in which the columns, the advertising columns, are of course not load-bearing. And whether or not Gösch's vision here comes to pass, my hope is that this project brings it just a touch closer to reality. Thank you. So I'm very happy to take any questions or try, yeah.
Hello.
I don't know if a mic is circulating, but yeah.
It was a fascinating lecture. Thank you so much. Can you hear me? No?
Yeah.
Yeah?
Yeah.
I wonder if his treatment in those psychiatric facilities was humane, because as you said, it was a new diagnosis, and what was the last 20 years of his life? Was it bearable for him, and how much art did he produce?
That's a great question. The question of the nature of his treatment and he was in very good and supportive hands for many years, in fact, under the care of his brother-in-law in a psychiatric facility. And things really went downhill, however, by the 30s in his condition, and he was under the care of Nazi doctors. So, but in the teens and the 20s, he was well cared for, and there was really a very progressive understanding of mental health at this moment, and his artwork was promoted. So you'll see in the exhibition there, he's drawing on, well, these are mostly works not made while institutionalized, but he's drawing on any kinds of paper he can get his hands on. But in the institutions, he was supported, and his creative practice was nurtured. Yeah.
Where were the two buildings that you showed black and white photographs of that were actually built? Where were they, or do they still exist?
So the glass house, the sort of...
Yeah, one was they both had domes.
Yeah, sort of pineapple-shaped,
Yep.
yeah. That was built in Cologne for an exhibition of the Deutsche Werkbund, which was like the alliance of artists, architects, and industry that was in some ways a precursor to the Bauhaus, and starts first decade of the 20th century, and actually in some form still goes today. But anyway, that was a pavilion sponsored by the German glass industry, and it was always intended to be temporary as an exhibition display. But it was especially temporary because World War I broke out during the show. And so this vision of utopia was really cut down at the knees by the onset of war. But it was built with sponsored by and with the materials of the German glass industry, and there were colored lights inside, there was a waterfall running through the center of it, there was sound piped in, so when we think about, immersive art experiences today, this was the precursor of this completely multi-sensory, phantasmagoric environment. Yeah. The other built work. Oh, yes, the sort of domed. Yes, right. So that was the first Goetheanum that was in Switzerland, in Dornach, Switzerland, and then its successor is better known and still stands today. But it burned down and was replaced by a reinforced concrete building, and that has a kind of sculpted massing and yeah.
I have a friend who's a retired architect in her 80s, lives in Nairobi. She studied at the Architectural Association in London, and she was a student of a lot of architects who got out from the Nazis. Now, she'd never even heard of this man,
yeah.
And I'm wondering, is our interest in him as an artist and because of his relationship with the regime, or is our interest in him really as an architect? Because it doesn't look as if we really know much what he would have done as an architect, except for those two buildings. Anyway, she was unimpressed. She said, "Oh, I think it's trash." But,
yeah.
But I don't know whom she had studied under at the Architectural Association in the 60s, but she said some of her instructors were people who had gotten out in the 30s, out from under the Nazis, and she just said she had never even heard of him. So
totally, no, I mean, no.
So some of his colleagues must not have had a respect of him as an architect. As an artist, I mean, I think this is fantastic, but I'm wondering, is our interest in him as an architect or as an artist?
I think both and. I mean, for me at least, I think, right, is this architecture? I mean, is it it's coming at a moment when his peers are also making similarly fanciful things. So not, but in this question about Bruno Taut and the glass house, he went on to build social housing, and it's sort of boxy, and the concession to expressionism is that it's colorful. It's but it's a far cry from the utopianism. My interest, is equally in it as art and as architecture, and so to show it in a museum of art like the Clark is to appreciate it for its the quality of the drawings in my mind. But also what it represents in the history of the avant-garde. I mean, it's, the hope is to slightly revise the canon and not just, think that the people who are famous now are the people who justly deserve to be, and to, in some ways, recuperate this figure and revise and say, this was actually someone who was very important. I mean, was he the absolute central figure of the early 20th century? No. But was he a figure who was exhibited and debated and championed in his time by the figures who wrote the history of 20th century architecture? Yes. And so, and I think there are also reasons. It's not just that he was forgotten. I think also his legacy, and this is my colleague Raphael Koenig, who's really an expert on the reception of mental health, especially in Germany, but wrote the other essay in the book, would say, it's not just that he was forgotten, it's that he was erased. So yeah, but have your friend come visit the show. Okay, well, that's on her. Yeah. Yeah, thank you.
So is it a quirk of fate or an irony that this expressionism was kind of born out of World War I's atrocities and then got shut down by the Nazis?
Can you ask the question again?
So I'm just thinking, is it a quirk of fate or an irony that this expressionism was, in a sense, born out of the atrocities of World War I and then got shut down by the Nazis?
Yeah. Yeah, I think, right, and the artists of who are in this exhibition of the early 20s represent a kind of second generation of expressionists, because you have, in 1905 and 1910, you have the movement beginning, but the work of the 20s is much more political, and it Yeah, it's no coincidence that it was shut down for, I think, that its humanity and its realism in many cases, mixed with its imagination and fantasy. And I think both of those things really coexist, that there is a grittiness and also a utopianism that would have been abhorrent to the sort of the purifying tendency of the purifying, classicizing, white supremacist sort of mandate of the Nazis. So I think it makes perfect sense, but it is also a tragic irony, yeah.
Is there a reason to focusing on the art that and drawings that came in between his treatment and not any of the pieces that came out during his treatment, especially given, that he was erased partly due to this mental health? Is that to kind of separate seeing him for the schizophrenia and as an artist without that stigma?
It's a really good question. The exhibition is made up of the drawings that we could borrow from, our neighbors a few hours north. And if I had my druthers, we would show a lot more borrow things from Europe and so on, but it's a little show, and their work is from that little slice of time. But it is a good question. I feel slightly less comfortable when talking about the question of how his mental health played into his work, and so to look at that earlier work, as I did in a couple cases, it's tricky ground to do after the fact, and not as a specialist, and not as a clinician, but I tried to show it in some way. At the same time, he had different stages. So the work that he was producing in the 19-teens, there's a lot more sort of pointillist application of pigment, and then he moved to much more sort of blockier, so styles changed, but there is a lot of consistency still. So to talk about his work, in or out of institutions, in some ways there are enough through lines that I'm trying to sketch out, but it's a good point, and there are, he has been exhibited in other contexts. Also, this is an exhibition specifically of the architecture, which he was also making it, I think, the most of at this time, sort of pure architecture. But he produced a ton of figuration, and that's simply not what we had access to. And also the size of the gallery made a focus helpful. But I also think the architecture, in or out of institutions, I think the architecture is some of his strongest work and some of his most distinctive. So it's a good question, and I don't really have a great answer, because I find it difficult to analyze to pretend to analyze the work that was made while he was institutionalized, or to do it only as an art historian, but to ignore the clinical side. It's very tricky, and I don't have a great solution. There's a question down here.
It's actually a follow-up to that. So if we were curious of seeing more of this person's work, where would we be able to see it, either online or in person?
Yeah. The three collections that hold his work, so one is in Montreal, and the two are in Europe. One's in Berlin and one's in Heidelberg. And the one in Berlin, and those two collections, as Raphael points out, sort of reproduce these dual readings, these split readings of him as avant-garde and as mentally ill. In Berlin, it's the Berlinische Gallery, which is like a city museum. I don't think they have any of his work on view, but it's in their collection. It's all on their website. So Berlinische Gallery, and they're credited in the book. And this is their drawing. So you can see it online. And the other one in Heidelberg, which is the Prinzhorn collection, which still exists, has published a couple books on Gösch in German, but we have them in our library, which is open to the public. And the website, not so much, but I think more and more, especially in the 20 teens and onward, there is more of his work online. So, really, until the 1960s, he was essentially forgotten, and then it makes sense that in the 60s, in the visionary architecture of that moment, people took a little bit more interest, and then again in the 80s, and so there are these moments And I think we're maybe in one of them, like 2015, 16, 17, like, so there has been a little bit more published, and I think, Wikipedia entries may be getting fleshed out, as we speak, and that's exciting, because this is someone who is really, there's just not that much that has been known about them, so yeah.
We'll take just one more question.
I see
And-
there are a couple more, yeah.
Oh, two more? Okay, we'll take two more questions.
Hi, yes, I know in the 30s, many artists and intellectuals were able to emigrate from Germany. Obviously, he was institutionalized, but maybe with the help of, were there any attempts by some of his contemporaries or even his brother-in-law to try to get him out? Do you know anything about that at all?
I don't. I think there was a sense that he was being well cared for when he was, and after that, I'm not sure. I mean, once, by the mid-30s, I'm not sure, under the Nazis, I don't know that they would have been able, because there was an extermination, program. So before that, though, I think there was a thought that he was really being cared for and he was in the right place. So, yeah.
Hello again. I was wondering if he ever traveled. He's so worldly in his drawings of architecture, but did he ever see any of those things in life, in reality?
The question of whether he saw these things in life. He, as a student in the sort of the grand tour, he traveled around Europe a bit, but the idea of really seeing the world, I mean, with the advent of offset printing in the early 20th century, the circulation of images and the sharing of them and the reproducing of them in illustrated newspapers, in books, was so rapid as a kind of globalization of images and a precursor to kind of our contemporary moment that he would not have seen the Buddhist temples that he was fascinated by and the mosques in person, but I think he and his peers would have known them from images, this was, a moment of really just sort of a global opening up of references and possibilities, yeah.
Well, thank you so much for your talk, Robert.